Okay, welcome, WHAP students to Chapter 33, The Building of Global Empires. Essentially, this is a scramble for Africa with a little bit of other stuff going on. You'll see some imperialism in Asia and Oceania, and you'll get just a touch of American imperialism as well in the Caribbean. All right, here's a map of imperialism in Asia circa 1914 on the eve of World War One. As you can see, Great Britain, France, Japan, United States, Netherlands, Russia, Portugal, princely states of India. You've got these Europeans got quite the presence here in Asia. Now, the idea of imperialism itself dates back from the mid 19th century as far as kind of giving it a word. And it's pretty popular as far as a word and an idea by the 1880s. Military imperialism is really the beginner, basically where you can force. You have stronger arms, you have stronger weapons, so you can force weaker countries to do what you want to do or give you what you want. But there are other kinds of imperialism, economic imperialism, especially U.S. imperialism that we'll discuss a little bit later on. There's a lot of different motivations for imperialism. Again, to grow your military, to be strong, a base of resources, of course, politically for you to be stronger because you're dominating a larger empire. And the economics is a big, big reason for imperialism. The added wealth and trading of the system itself. It fits in with European capitalism for sure. And you get also religious and demographic imperialism as well. Manifest destiny, an idea that especially comes about in the United States, but it's not limited just to them. You get what you get is discovering natural resources in areas, and you're going to have the haves, the industrialized nations, want to exploit those resources, and they want to use cheap labor to do it. So you're going to see slavery, and you're going to see a working class that isn't paid very much money. They're looking for expansion in markets. They want more people to buy their goods. And Africa is a whole new world. There's a lot of market there to be had. This term, the white man's burden, you need to know it was coined by Rudyard Kipling, who you probably know from writing the book, The Jungle Book. Also, some other really good short stories as well. He was a white British man who was raised in India. He could speak Hindi very well, but he went to boarding school in England and then later on returned to his home in India. And French mission civilisation is basically civilizing. The French see themselves when they colonize that they are civilizing a barbarous people, that they're spreading the greatest culture on earth, which is white culture in their mind. There are geopolitical considerations to be thought of here. That these places that European countries are taking over, and in some ways America too, give them strategic footholds. Waterways such as the Panama Canal for America, that was huge. You didn't have to go all the way around South America. And the Suez Canal means you don't have to go all the way around Africa. It allowed for supply stations for long voyages. But it did lead to imperial rivalries. It is going to help put the world on track for World War One, without a doubt. There's also domestic home political considerations. There's a crisis of industrialism. You have pressure from a new ideology, socialism, out of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels out of Germany. Remember, the short-term effects of industrialism are very bad, and people are growing weary of them, growing tired of them. But when you're conquering other countries, that comes as a bit of a distraction. They can use that. So imperial policies distract the proletariat, the working class, from domestic policies. You got a guy that you need to know, Cecil Rhodes, another Britishman, who's putting forth the idea that imperialism is actually an alternative to civil war to keep the proletariat from rising up and fighting against their capitalist masters. We know that transportation gives rise in this time period, especially because of the Industrial Revolution. It's going to play a large part in imperialism. The transportation of steamships and railroads, that's going to take place in Africa and in Asia. The Europeans are going to have to build up a tremendous infrastructure to get what they want out of these areas. I told you the Suez Canal was very, very important, and so was the Panama Canal for America. Weaponry in this time period, you're looking at, you go from basically muzzle-loading muskets. By the mid-century, you've got breech-loading rifles. Reduced loading time. Basically, they can fire more shots per minute. Then in the 1880s, you get a machine gun, the first machine gun called the Maxim gun, which is shooting 11 rounds per second. Eventually, that'll get up to, by World War I, you'll have machine guns firing 500 rounds a minute. So enormous rounds. Hard. It's going to be hard for the natives to fight against that, especially when you're fighting with wicker shields and spears. So that does give a tremendous military advantage to the Europeans. You have some battles, but your theme to know is that the Europeans typically suffer very little loss of life, and that the natives suffer quite a bit. They're essentially bringing a knife to a gunfight. They are just outmanned, outgunned. Communication, this is very, very important. Correspondence, as far as how long it took for somebody in India to talk to somebody back home in Britain. So you have these British people running India, and they're asking things from the crown and stuff. It took 2 years in 1830 for information to get from India to Britain and back to India. 2 years. That's an incredibly long time. But after the Suez Canal, that drops all the way down to 2 weeks. So lightning fast speed by those time period standards. And then later on, you get telegraph, which makes it even better. Telegraph comes about in the 1870s over there, and then it will take correspondence down to 5 hours. So that's a big, big deal. Make sure you understand the role that correspondence will play in imperialism. As I've said, India is the jewel of the British crown, and a lot of India belonging to Britain comes from the East India Company, a joint stock company. They get a monopoly on the India trade. And in the beginning, they actually got permission from Mughal emperors who I'm not sure knew exactly what they were getting into. Obviously, they're going to end up taking over India. The Mughal Empire declined after the death of Aurangzeb in 1707, and that's going to play right into the British hands. As you can see, the home of a wealthy family in Calcutta. Living nice. Protection of economic interest through political conquest. The British are conquering territory to ensure that their economy stays strong. They want more markets. They want more raw resources. Remember, Britain's limited because they're on an island. So these colonies are doing them a tremendous amount of good with their natural resources and cheap labor. There are British and Indian troops called sepoys. We have mentioned those before, and here's a picture. You have a British man on the left and a native and actual Indian there on the right, both sepoys. Now, the Sepoy Revolt or Sepoy Revolution or Sepoy Protest, it's called different things sometimes, happens in 1857, and it's based off of religion, basically. They get these new rifles. The cartridges come in a wax paper greased with animal fat. The Hindus are worried that it's beef, and the Muslims are worried that it's pork, and those are both sacred in their respective religions. So they ain't going to do it. The British try to force them. They fight back. They end up capturing a garrison, and they kill 60 soldiers and 180 civilian men after they surrender. And then later on, they're still killing people. But the British are going to retake the fort, and they're going to end up hanging the rebels, and they're going to put down the Sepoy Revolt. Britain establishes something called direct rule. They establish a civil service staffed by Englishmen, and they'll allow the Indians at the low-level positions, as civil servants. When the British come into India, they organize their agriculture around tea, coffee, and opium so that they can use that opium to get China addicted, and you end up fighting the Opium Wars a little bit later on. The British make a decided they put their stamp on their culture, on Indian environment. And really, the British just kind of mask over the Hindu uh, Muslim relations, which we know are poor. And later on, when they are fighting for their independence, they are concerned with what's going to happen when the British are not there anymore. And you're going to see it does turn bloody. Now, imperialism is growing strong in Central Asia. The British, French, and Russians are competing for Central Asia. But France is going to back out a little bit after Napoleon. They've got some issues they're trying to deal with. Russia is active after the 1860s in these different lands in Central Asia. They even get up to India. They actually approach India. Something called the Great Game, basically Russia versus British intrigue in Afghanistan, a tough place to hold. But the Russian Revolution in 1917, when the Tsar Nicholas and his family get killed, that's going to essentially stop that between them and the British. Plus, they are fighting World War I by this time. Now, there's imperialism in Southeast Asia. Spain takes the Philippines. The Dutch take Indonesia. And the British establish a presence from the 1820s on. There are conflicts with kings of Burma. But the British are going to establish colonial authority there. The French colonized Vietnam. That's going to come back. We're going to talk about that when we talk about the Vietnam War. They also colonized Cambodia and Laos, and they're encouraging conversion to Christianity there. These are going to turn into bloody affairs later on. As you can see by the map, there is a representation of about 8 different European countries here in Africa, and they're just carving up what they can. Which leads to the scramble for Africa, roughly from 1875 to 1900. You get the French, the Portuguese, the Belgians, and the English competing for what they call the Dark Continent because nothing's known about it. It's like this place where, who knows, you'll find gold, you'll find diamonds, you'll find iron ore and other natural resources. The continent's huge, and they're excited about it. There's all these opportunities for the European countries. The British established a strong presence in Egypt and in an African place called Rhodesia, named after Cecil Rhodes, a Britishman. And again, they get control and build the Suez Canal, which makes their colonies in Africa a lot more profitable. And Rhodesia is going to provide them with gold and diamonds. So pretty big deal. Europe's going to be able to explore the rivers. And that's going to allow them to map the African interior. You get a really bad dude that is never talked about. We talk about Hitler and Stalin and Mao Zedong, but most people never heard of King Leopold II. But King Leopold II was out of Belgium, and he colonized Congo, and he had these rubber factories and stuff, and he basically uses the people, and when they don't work hard enough for him, he has their hands cut off and has them killed. I mean, he kills 8 million Congolese people. Now, that's a bigger number than how many Jews were killed in the Holocaust. I mean, but you've never heard of him. It's crazy. Down south in Africa, in South Africa colony, you get the Boer War, a short 3-year war here. And it comes about because you have the Dutch presence down there, who their farmers were called Boers. And eventually, and today they're called Afrikaners. So if it's a white person from South Africa and they're Dutch, then they're an Afrikaner. They compete with native peoples, the Khoikhoi and the Xhosa peoples. But Britain swoops in. The Dutch have been losing prestige. The British come in, and South Africa's got way too many good resources. The British cannot resist. So they swoop in and take over in 1806. And they take slaves from there. The Afrikaners, the Dutch, end up migrating eastward in something called the Great Trek, and they end up overpowering the natives, such as the Zulu, a very powerful warrior group, because they have superior firepower. They have guns, they have machine guns, and they begin establishing independent republics in those areas. Remember, the Dutch have had republics for a while. The British tolerate that. They're no big deal until gold's discovered, and then we got an issue. That's going to lead to white-on-white conflict. You got black soldiers fighting. You got laborers. The Afrikaners end up conceding in 1902, and in 1910 are integrated into the Union of South Africa. So South Africa has some diversity there. All right, Berlin Conference, very important, 1884 and 1885. You get 14 European states and America, because we are a big dog, even though we're not partaking in African colonization or Asian colonization at this point. Well, I say that. Yeah, no Asian. I mean, Hawaii. It's going to be Oceania, really. Unfortunately, at the Berlin Conference, no African states were present. Nobody cared what those people wanted, their viewpoints, any of that. And they established at the Berlin Conference the rules of colonization. Any European state can take any unoccupied territory after they inform the other European powers. So it's basically exploration and then claim it. Exploration and claim it. European firepower dominates Africans. There's really only two exceptions. Ethiopia fights off Italy in 1896, and Liberia is sort of like a U.S. colony. It's where many of our freed slaves were sent after the Civil War, and so America kind of has a connection with them, and it basically protects them from the other European powers. All right. You're getting private companies getting large tracts of land. They're going to exploit natural resources. They don't care what happens to Native Africans at this point. The companies have the freedom to tax, recruit labor. They abuse the people horribly. Like I said, King Leopold II is a prime example of this. The profit margin really isn't that good, especially for how many people are being killed. Now, there are two different types of colonial rule. The first of those is direct rule, which is what France uses. And again, they feel as though they're civilizing these people. But there's chronic shortage of European personnel. There's not enough people. Language and cultural barriers exist. But the French are trying to rule the Africans directly. There's going to be 3,600 in French West Africa, 3,600 Europeans to rule 9 million natives. The British are going to take a different route. They're going to use indirect rule. And with that, they're going to use indigenous native institutions. And basically, they're just going to answer to a British person higher on up. And they're going to let the natives basically run their own affairs as long as they're, taxing who they want taxed, and as long as, the profit, is there. One of the worst things that comes from this, though, is the establishing borders. The Europeans will come through and they will draw lines on the map that cut through tribal patterns, and they are going to lump tribes that have basically blood feud with each other into the same area. It's going to lead to a lot of strife between natives. So natives are fighting against themselves and fighting against the Europeans as well. There's again, U.S. and French and British, Dutch possessions out there. The English used Australia as a penal colony from 1788 on. That's where they dumped their prisoners when their prisons got too full. But voluntary migrants are going to fall. There are people who decide to go there. Gold is discovered in 1851, so that's going to get a large migration coming to Australia. And just like it happened in America, smallpox and measles devastate the native people who are called Aborigines. New Zealand, right off the coast of Australia, natives are forced to sign the Treaty of Waitangi, which placed New Zealand under British protection. There's no answer for these peoples. You can't use that boomerang to fight off a Britishman with a machine gun. Just can't do it. And the measles and smallpox are just devastating Aborigine populations. And you can see that. By 1900, look at the European population versus the native population. They've just totally displaced them. European imperialism in the Pacific Islands. They're looking for commercial trading outposts. Whaling was a big thing in the 1800s. That whales were used for oil to light lamps, and their fat was used. It was a profitable business. Merchants were seeking sandalwood and sea slugs for sale in China. Missionaries are God, glory, and gold. Missionaries are out there seeking more people to convert to Christianity. And so the British, French, German, and American powers carved out the Pacific Islands. Remember, we take Hawaii. Speaking of U.S. imperialism, President James Monroe warns Europeans not to engage in imperialism in the Western Hemisphere. He issues something you need to know called the Monroe Doctrine. Basically, all the Americas are a U.S. protectorate. It's in our zone of influence, our sphere of influence, and we don't want Europe there. And remember what's going on in this time period. Mexico and all these other South American countries are fighting for their independence and pushing European rule out. Meanwhile, America is like, and stay out. We have this over here, and we're going to use our influence. We're going to use different types of imperialism on this side of the world. Our imperialism age, one of the big purchases is Alaska in 1867. We buy it from Russia, 2 cents an acre. It's a steal. Everybody thought it was William Seward, the Secretary of State, thought that he was an idiot for doing it. They called it Seward's folly or Seward's icebox, but Alaska has turned out to be a very good acquisition to the United States of America. In 1875, we get our business, our hooks into Hawaii, basically, and by 1898, we have overthrown Hawaii. Queen Liliuokalani was the last monarch of Hawaii. And this is based off of economic imperialism. We had sugar companies in Hawaii, and pineapple companies in Hawaii, like Dole pineapple, and they wanted Hawaii annexed into America. Certain presidents didn't want to, and they end up just taking it over, and we end up annexing it under William McKinley. All right, Spanish Cuba. It's not usually called that in American history. The Spanish-American War, or the War of 1898. The United States declares war on Spain after the battleship Maine, which is our battleship, was sunk in Havana Harbor. It was actually an accident, but we were angry with Spain at the time, so we thought it was them. So that's enough for us to declare war. We whipped Spain pretty easily. They are not a powerhouse anymore, and we are. So we take possession of Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. Again, this is our age of imperialism. The United States intervenes in other Caribbean and Central American lands. We occupied the Dominican Republic and Nicaragua, Honduras, and Haiti. We were everywhere. But the Filipinos revolted against Spanish rule and later on against our rule. We'll fight them in the U.S.-Filipino War. They actually killed more of us than the Spanish did. But they ain't going to win. We're going to hang on to Philippines until World War II. Panama Canal is an enormous acquisition by the United States. Started under President Teddy Roosevelt. We offered to buy it, but the Colombians did not want to sell it to us. So we knew that there was a group in Colombia called the Panamanians who wanted their own independent country. So we say, hey, we'll help you get your own independent country, and you're going to sell us this land for this canal. And that was the agreement. We roll up there with some gunships, and guess who wins? The Panamanians. And so they give us like a 100-year lease on the Panama Canal, which cuts through Central America instead of having to go all the way around South America. So that's a big monetary gain for America. Roosevelt Corley is added to the Monroe Doctrine. And in Roosevelt's Corley, it says the United States has the right to intervene in domestic affairs of other nations if U.S. investments were threatened. So if there's a sugar company in Cuba and they get a ruler that we don't like, we feel like we can intervene in that. It's imperialism, without a doubt. Economic imperialism here. Japanese, there's going to be some expansion there as well. In the 1870s, they colonized the northern region, Hokkaido and Kuril Islands, and southern Okinawa and the Ryukyu Islands as well. 1876, Japanese purchased warships from Britain so that they can dominate Korea. That's imperialism. The Sino-Japanese War over Korea resulted in Japanese victory. Sino means China. So Japan beats China for possession of Korea. And that's going to be the trend. Japan is an up-and-comer. They're industrialized. Very shortly after that, they're going to smoke the Russians in the Russo-Japanese War. And they're doing great. And they're going to be doing great for a while. There are economic legacies of imperialism. Colonized states were encouraged to exploit natural resources rather than build manufacturing centers. Basically, they want the colonies always to be dependent on them. They don't want them building their own factories like what happened in America. They encourage dependency on imperial power for manufacturing goods made from native raw products, just like I said, Indian cotton. So Indians are going to, grow the cotton and process the cotton, but they're going to ship it to Britain, who's going to make shirts to sell to the Indians. They're not allowed to make their own shirts there in India. There's introductions of new crops such as tea and Ceylon. Not a huge deal there, but so you can see imperialism and migration during the 19th and early 20th century. You have a lot of migrations. People are moving around the world. Never been easier. Europeans moved to temperate lands for better weather because a lot of European weather can be kind of rough. They work as free cultivators, industrial laborers. 32 million Europeans come to the United States in a 114-year period. We are a destination, just as we are today. Africans, Asians, and Pacific Islanders moved to tropical and subtropical lands. Indentured laborers, manual laborers, 2.5 million of them between 1820 and 1914. Some of these aren't far off from slavery, without a doubt. Of course, there's colonial conflict. There are thousands of insurrections against colonial rule. It doesn't matter if you're in Asia, Africa. They don't like being ran by white people who don't care anything about them. Let's see. And listen, the theme, you don't have to remember all these little battles and stuff. The theme is the theme. That the native peoples don't have the guns, they don't have the weapons to fight the Europeans off. Scientific racism is developed. And they kind of use Charles Darwin's ideas to form something you must know called social Darwinism. And social Darwinism says that, rich people are rich because they're smarter and more hardworking than poor people. It also says that white people are basically the superior race. The Anglo-Saxons especially are the dominant race on the earth, and that the other peoples, the darker peoples, are subjects to them, or should be subjects to them. You get some more nationalism and anti-colonial movements, people wanting their own nation states. Ram Mohan Roy, he was called the father of modern India, so he is looking to gain Indian independence. Him and his group, his reformers call for self-government and adoption of selected British practices. Influence of Enlightenment thought often obtained in European universities. A lot of the leaders of Indian nationalism were trained in British colleges. They went to college there and they studied the Enlightenment and they loved the ideas and they say, hey, that speaks to me and I want to take it back home. The Indian National Congress, you got to know them. They form in 1885. And that's the Hindu version. They're looking for nationalism. But there's also Muslims in India, and they have their own thing called the Muslim League. And so in 1906, these two joined forces, basically, which I'm sure was hard for them to do since they hate each other so much. Okay, so that is your chapter, The Scramble for Africa. The major theme, of course, is imperialism, and understand that imperialism comes in multiple varieties, whether it's military imperialism or political militarism. And there is a large spike in racism in this time period, fueled by Darwinism, social Darwinism, the white man's burden, the idea that the Europeans are doing these peoples a favor, taking them out of barbary and providing them with Jesus and stuff like that. And shouldn't be too hard for you to remember. Should be a fairly easy chapter. And make sure you're taking good notes and get you a good summary in there.